can we turn off the slide? It's pushing hot air on this.
Pushing our EMFs on you too.
I love EMFs. I have no problem with EMFs. I worked in a power plant for 25 years. I'm still here. So.
A lot of irons.
Should we record it so let it cool down?
Nah, I don't want it to. Please, it's too hot. So, about myself, I worked 25 years in a power plant for Pacific Gas and Electric in Morant, which is now NRG, one of the intermediate pirate people from the 2000 energy crisis. I testified secretly before the PUC on that crisis, since I was at the heart of the operations for Morant at the time the crisis took off in California. And it's through that experience that I started getting interested in energy. I mean, I was a control operator in a power plant, so you'd think I would be interested in energy, but no, because I was alienated labor and I hated the company, which I still do. I didn't like my job. Well, I liked my job, but it wasn't enough to really investigate it. When the 2000 energy crisis hit, I started to really study what it took to run a grid in the United States, or in California at least. And I started changing my views. I was a very avid anti-nuclear activist. I was in the Shoreham Alliance when I was in high school in New York in the 1970s, which I found out, not at the time, but it was financed by the Long Island Home Heating Oil Association because they didn't want to see nuclear compete with their fossil fuel. And that's today a continuing problem, though it has to do with natural gas and not with home heating oil per se. I agree with most of the points that Gene raised in his presentation. But during the process of my learning about energy, I became avidly pro-nuclear and very much against solar energy and wind energy as an alternative to fossil fuel. But I'm not really here to speak on that particular question. It would be a good one, and we could do something like that on nuclear energy, alternative energies. How to confront the climate crisis maybe would be the best topic for me to participate with Gene on. I will address this nuclear energy issue, but more along the way, his point number 7 on nuclear energy in the slideshow. So, one of the myths, actually one of the issues that Gene pointed to, and is an issue that's often raised by anti-nuclear activists, is the issue of proliferation, which is really, I don't know if Gene would agree with that, but that's really what the sort of issue is in terms of the point of this forum today, which is about the connection between nuclear weapons and research and commercial nuclear energy, or nuclear energy for peaceful means. So the timeline on this is a very split one, and you get a little bit of a sense of that with the timeline that he put up there with nuclear weapons being used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and August 9th, respectively, the threats against Russia and other countries, and the advent of Atoms for Peace, the Eisenhower-era initiative to build peaceful nuclear energy. But there are some things that are you should have delved more into. They were very upfront about their nuclear weapons aspect. It's not true that they tried to hide this. In congressional testimony, when the Atomic Energy Commission head, Admiral Rickover, and others were talking about Atoms for Peace, they said this is a dual purpose. We can build fast reactors, a type of reactor, that can produce prodigious amounts of energy. They didn't care about clean at the time. Nobody used that term. That's a new term. And tons of plutonium for our military forces. Most people, in a general sort of way, were pro-nuclear energy. They were pro-nuclear weapons. They thought this was a force for peace. And that's where a good part of, I think, your slideshow, it was always the gun pointed at someone's head. Collier's Magazine in 1953 ran an article that said, we can easily drop parachutists, rangers, into the Ural Mountains and seize Stalin's nuclear weapons arsenal, and then we can obliterate Leningrad and Moscow. It was talked about this in the public. This was not a period when you had to put on just a peaceful face. American aggression. I mean, one of the first things that happened after World War II a small little propaganda, very symbolic. In World War II, the department that ran the Army, the Navy, and the Marines was the War Department. One of the first things they did was change it to the Defense Department. So they started putting in this, like, you know, it's a force for peace. That's what the military is. I think it was even in the same bill that set up the Air Force, if I'm not mistaken. But at any rate, so among all the practical physicists and theoretical physicists that developed an atom bomb in the Manhattan Project were of divided political loyalties. You had the Edward Tellers, the Ulam, I guess his name was, who wanted to build bigger and better bombs and more bombs. And this was very much in line with what the military was doing. But there was another wing, like Oppenheimer, who's mentioned there, that was very much opposed to this and were actually in favor of nuclear energy. Now, Oppenheimer changed his mind later on nuclear energy. But in the beginning, Einstein, Oppenheimer, Alvin Weinberg, who actually has the patent on the light water reactor, were all on the left politically. They were socialists. They were advocates of integration. In fact, one of the big...
You have to mention Szilard.
Szilard. Yeah, there was a lot of leftists who were involved with, who regret their work on the Manhattan Project, and demanded, along with the organized Marxist left, that we have atoms for peace. This was not Eisenhower's administration's invention. It was very much a left-wing perspective. We need to put the atoms for people, not for war. Should be used to develop humanity's creativity and not to destroy it through nuclear war. And many of them, Alvin Weinberg was out of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory where they produced plutonium for a period, did a lot of the research on nuclear weapons, led the battle against the all-white workforce when they tried to integrate Oak Ridge. 10,000 member United Steelworkers Local took a position, a reactionary position against the hiring of blacks. The physicists there were able to split the union on this question and win over a number of people toward integration. So these people come from a serious social justice perspective, in many, as such as that was in 1954, 1955. But there are connections. Clearly, the Manhattan Project, as a solely military project, was the birth of modern atomic energy, whether it's military or for peace, for commercial nuclear energy. And in fact, many of the physicists went on, like Alvin Weinberg, to develop and demand the application of peaceful nuclear energy. Many of them supported unilateral nuclear disarmament by the United States and the Soviet Union. And so there was a big crossover in these early days, in the 50s and even into the 60s, of the advocacy by the left of peaceful nuclear energy. Very specifically, the Communist Party USA, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Socialist Party, all advocated, not in a campaign form, the unilateral nuclear disarmament and the conversion of nuclear industries toward peaceful nuclear energy. So there is a history to this that did exist 50 and 60 years ago, 70 years ago in some cases. So what are the other areas? So let me say what the myth is. The myth is this, and I think it's an important myth that we need, that at least you need to be aware of. Maybe you'll go home and research it and look it up. One is that when you have a nuclear energy industry, you get a nuclear weapons industry. And you've heard this before. The Greenpeace is a big pusher of this. The National Radioactive Action Committee is a big pusher of this. And it's simply ahistorical and untrue. Peaceful nuclear energy came from weapons of mass destruction, not the other way around. But early on, this manifestation of a peaceful use of nuclear energy was from 1946. Immediately in 1946, they started to build research reactors that were designed to produce nuclear energy, peaceful nuclear energy. You mentioned the one in Simi Valley. It's true. It was a criticality accident. Nothing, I don't think, actually melted. This was the early days of nuclear reactors. And they wanted to build nuclear reactors that produced energy, not always nuclear weapons. Now, GE, who sponsored the one out here in Livermore, as part of the Livermore Labs. Livermore Labs was a nuclear weapons research. It was set up basically by Edward Teller to make a bomb, theoretically a bomb that could blow up the entire planet. He was one of the original, it's better dead than red. perspectives. They couldn't, didn't even get close to anything like that, even on a theoretical basis, thank goodness. But he was the big advocate of the 50 megaton nuclear weapon, which was actually never really developed. But on the peaceful side of this, the physicists started to divide where they went in their careers, where the technology went. And I will say this, is that the origin of the myth is that the spent nuclear fuel from a nuclear reactor like the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant is somehow the feedstock for nuclear weapon grade uranium and plutonium. And this is a lie. This has never, it's happened to my knowledge, one place in the world, which is India. The first atomic bomb, they did use their first, it was really an experimental reactor because India did not sign a non-proliferation treaty, nor did Pakistan, nor did Israel. South Africa did, so they violated it when they developed their nuclear bomb. But you can have a nuclear weapons industry without a commercial nuclear reactor. Israel shows that. They have no commercial program whatsoever. Their Dimona nuclear power plant is officially called a R&D reactor, research and development, which it is. And they also produced about 100 atomic weapons out of it. No electricity. I flew around that plant when I was in Israel when I was a kid. And all the electrical lines that go to it go to the plant. They don't come from the plant. So North Korea is another one that shows that you can develop a nuclear weapon without a commercial nuclear industry. And not only that, but there's about 20 countries in the world, from Japan to Belgium to Netherlands to Germany, that have never have a robust nuclear energy programs without having a nuclear weapons program. It is true, in all honesty, that many countries considered it. There's no question about it, largely because a lot of the physics, some of the enrichment capabilities where you increase the amount of usable fissionable material like uranium-235 is the same equipment that can be used to increase the enrichment up over 90% and create a bomb that could have an uncontrolled fission reaction. And that is true, but most countries quickly dropped that program, either because of opposition by the United States or because the UN mandated through the NPT, which actually did have an effect, a positive effect. One of the things that it did was to help encourage the setup of the International Atomic Energy Commission. The International Atomic Energy Commission, which was modeled on the America's Atomic Energy Commission on the civilian side, helped nations develop research and development reactors around the world. Egypt's got 4 reactors. People don't know that. Vietnam, in the middle of the Vietnam War, had a research reactor in the first city that fell in the liberation of Vietnam by the North Vietnamese, in An Loc. And they fought around it. Nobody knew this, nobody talked about it at the time. And the reactor just sat there kind of like off. And it was never bombed or anything, thank goodness. But and there's another issue with the regulations of research reactors, which is a problem. But the IAEA has done a really good job in getting countries to develop peaceful civilian oversight, safety regimes, and engineering for the peaceful use of nuclear energy. So I think that's an important point. In the United States, basically only the United States, the other areas where there is a connection is in the operating staff of nuclear power plants. Most operators in the United States at the 100 nuclear power plants that exist in the United States are staffed by ex-Navy nuclear personnel. That is, they join the Navy. A friend of mine did this. 2 friends of mine did this. They become radiation experts, health experts, engineering experts on how to run a nuclear reactor, how to design a nuclear reactor. They come out and they become nuclear plant operators. There's some of that in England and France, but not much because their nuclear navy is very small. Most are just trained. But this goes to the other real connection between nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. And it's one I haven't talked about yet, but it's the actual direct link that is a good link in the sense of where it ended up. What is that link? It's in the Navy nuclear propulsion area. That is the actual construction of reactors for submarines and aircraft carriers, were designed in conjunction with the idea of using these same reactors to make electricity with. It's not in the actual weapon aspect of it, of the boom, of the bomb, but it is in terms of Navy propulsion to create reactors. The reactor on a nuclear submarine, it's a smaller reactor. It's about 30 megawatts. Diablo Canyon's reactors are about 1,200 megawatts, to give you an idea of the scale. But the essential fission reaction and the engineering is very similar. And so many of the same labs where the reactors were developed for the Navy, such as especially in Westinghouse, GE a little bit less so. GE was always more into the bombs than it was into the reactor side of it. But some of the same people, the engineers, worked on both. I personally know one, Ed Field, who worked on designing Westinghouse's reactors and the smaller reactors for the U.S. Navy. That's a real connection. But I want to point out something. If Gene's side of the discussion wins the argument, and fortunately I think the argument's changing, it's going the other way toward my point of view, but let's just say that Greenpeace and World Wildlife Federation and Union of Concerned Scientists were kings for the day. And they had stopped all nuclear energy and shut down all the nuclear power plants. And you stop and mandated nuclear disarmament around the globe. What do you do with all that nuclear fissionable material?
Very good question.
Yes. They don't. I actually asked this at a meeting once 10 years ago, and they didn't say, well, we'll have to deal with that then. It's terrible. We went on about the legacy of it, and there's nothing we can do. Okay. So all that's a lie. I mean, it's just an engineering lie from the first breath to the last punctuation. There's a lot of things that you can do with this. And I want to give you, there's one program that Clinton signed into law that set up a joint program with the Russians in 1996, and that was called the Megatons to Megawatts. It was the only true swords into plowshares program ever implemented in any country, certainly on an international level. And they took a lot of the decaying uranium bombs from the Russians. There were about just 8,000 of those, by the way, that's not included in that number, and broke down the bombs, which were already sort of breaking down because of the neutron flux of the uranium, the enriched uranium. Actually, it wasn't neutron flux; it was just developed decayed heat, and the instrumentation especially couldn't last that long. And they took that highly enriched uranium and they downblended it into nuclear fuel at a rate of about 4%. And we took the fuel and we used them in every nuclear power plant in the United States for 15 years. 50% of all the fuel used in nuclear power plants for 15 years were made from decommissioned nuclear weapons.
10% of all our power.
And it was 10. Marty's right. In other words, every 10th electron in the grid in the United States was produced from a degraded nuclear weapon that was downblended to usable fuel. This should be endorsed by everybody, yet it was not. It was opposed. Greenpeace in particular hated this because it was another check mark on their Chinese menu of what's good and what's bad about nuclear energy. And we have enough bombs, as evidenced by the slideshow, that we could run the United States ourselves to downblend that fuel probably for 50 to 60 years alone, or certainly to the end of the century. That's what we should do with it instead of letting it sit around in warehouses. That's one of the reasons I'm pro-nuclear. The second reason is the nuclear waste, the high-level nuclear waste. In the industry, we call that spent nuclear fuel. It's classified as HLW, high-level waste, by the NRC. And that is the stuff, if you sat on it, you would die pretty quickly. It is very dangerous out to 300 years. It's less dangerous, but still dangerous out for a few thousand years. I have a disagreement with my comrade here on this question. But the regulations are such that we have to do something with it. Well, for those of us who are pro-nuclear Marxists and pro-nuclear activists in general, the nuclear waste is not a problem, it's an issue. There are many ways. Again, I posed the question to Greenpeace and they just go, it's a disaster. There's nothing we can do with it. And it's not true. The French industry, France is green, if you look at all the maps, because 70 to 80% of their energy, of their electrical generation, I should say, comes from nuclear power. They have a 75% nuclear grid. Sweden has a 65% nuclear grid. Ontario has a 65% nuclear grid. And it's one of the reasons their carbon footprint is so low. So climate change was the big motivation for me also, because it started getting really popular in the early 2000s, to support nuclear energy. Just like James Hansen from NASA, who was anti-nuclear. He's the father of climate change science, basically, who about 7 years ago, said, I can't support renewables anymore. We need to have a dense, deployable form of energy that works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We need to go nuclear. He hasn't come out against renewables, but his main thrust has been in favor of developing the very new generations, the meltdown-proof reactors that are being deployed in China right now. They have one online. And you can turn off the electricity and walk away from the plant, come back in a month, and the heat and temperature are all down because of the way they've done the design of it. There's a lot of money going into Generation 4 reactors. These are smaller reactors, 300 megawatts or less. The big reactors are 1,000 megawatts or more. This really holds promise. Hundreds of millions of dollars are going into the research on this thing. And I think it's a very important thing to understand. But one of the things I call for is unilateral nuclear disarmament. Everybody should do this. How much time do I have?
You have used up 20 minutes.
Okay. And so that going back to the whole issue of weapons. So for me, the metaphor or analogy maybe is better to use is like we have these nuclear weapons. We had this research and development. Hundreds of millions of dollars in 1945 terms were spent on the Manhattan Project. I think it was $200 million. You know the number? At the time. I mean, this was a huge amount of even the war spending that was going on for other forms of war. And the what came out of this, though, was an understanding of fission power, of how to control it, how to not control it in the case of a weapon, because that's what that is. It's an uncontrolled nuclear reaction. And immediately, as I mentioned earlier in my talk, we needed to have a way of having a peaceful use of this new science and engineering instead of making war. And society did that. Capitalism did it. The Russians did it. As Gene said in 1954, they actually had the first reactor to be connected to the grid. It was a small reactor. I think it was 4 megawatts. It wasn't very big. The United States followed shortly thereafter. And in that sense, yes, there's a connection. There's a scientific connection. Many of the same people. But the course of that development went in another direction. It didn't go in the direction of ICBMs and hydrogen bombs and all these other things and that are destruction. So we need to get rid of nuclear weapons. And it's unfortunately that, though everybody on the left is in favor, I think, of unilateral nuclear disarmament, we don't really talk about it very much. And we should be, because Trump wants to started under Obama. They started rebuilding our nuclear arsenal again. And this is really scary. I also want to go back to the thing that you mentioned about them wanting to use nuclear weapons and the first strike thing. Forget all the 1945 and 1950 stuff for a second. That was the hubris of American imperialism in the American century at that time. But that was never dropped, despite what they say publicly in news briefs, in Pentagon news briefs, before Congress, and as ex-Pentagon officials like Ellsberg let us know, it's not just him, there are many others, is the United States has always had, I'm repeating Gene, has always had a first strike perspective. There's a debate whether that's actually strategically or tactic. And tactically, where you use it in a local area, it can quickly blow up into a strategic area where the whole globe is blown up. And where this comes to play, the specifics of it, is in Germany. It was during the 60s that this became talked about a lot more. The development of smaller nuclear weapons, or even just using the bigger ones, not to hit Russia with, but in case that the Warsaw Pact tanks came across the pass in central Germany, north of Czechoslovakia, to invade Western Europe, to invade Europe. And the United States said, yes, we most definitely have a first strike capability. Anyway, we already proved it in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. We already proved that we will have a first strike capability if it means winning a war or speeding up the winning of a war. We've already proven that. The Russians, and this is regardless of what one might think of the former Soviet Union or Stalin or anybody else. One thing you learn from hearing interviews with Soviet generals is they are scared of war. Now, this may have changed. This is now a new generation who didn't experience World War II. The Russians would do anything in order to avoid a nuclear war, or almost any war with the West, because they saw what it did to them. They lost 20 million. They think 20 million people. It was probably a lot more in Russia alone, in the Soviet Union alone. So they never had a first strike capability. They have, even to this day, more safeguards on their nuclear weapons than the United States has, that we have on our nuclear weapons, both from the ICBM down to tactical artillery and other forms of nuclear destruction. This scares the shit out of me. Having said that, though, one of the things that happened, one of the reasons we were never in a nuclear war, and this is a political thing, that's my personal, really my only, I'm the only one I know who has this perspective.
30 seconds.
Thank you. Is that the Russians did get a bomb. Because if they didn't get a bomb, I can guarantee the United States would have used a bomb. After all, it's what prevented the United States, in my opinion, from bombing China and invading China. So that's it.
Thank you.